time. And the first segment that's coming out of this research is going to be about children. And so what better place to think about the sustainability of Detroit. And you know what, I found out that's so interesting, Stephen, because you said you don't think of sustainable and Detroit in the same sentence. But kids are thinking about sustainability, and it's amazing. So what we documented was one school, Paul Robeson Malcolm X Academy in Detroit, and then another school in St. John's School. It's a parochial school in Rochester, and their competition in the Future City project.
Oh, really?
So like this is a national competition. Both of these schools decided to reimagine Detroit as a future city.
One group of kids growing up in the city, one group of
kids growing up in the suburbs.
Yeah, right.
And it was so interesting because there were so many similar things, and the sustainability was really, really part of their lexicon. Detroit kids and suburban kids are talking about a walkable city.
Right.
They're talking about being locavores. They don't use those words, but I asked the kids in Detroit, well, why do you have to have farms? They had farms ringing the city, and they said, well, I mean, why should we ship food from way, across the United States when we can grow it right here? So those ideas are really, really ingrained into a new generation in a way that they weren't for me. I don't know about for you.
Well, and I think that's what's interesting. I mean, my own kids who are still living between Detroit and Baltimore think of Detroit as this wonderful garden spot. I mean, they see all of the things that those of us who are adults don't see, and they don't see all of the things that keep us up worrying at night. And so I think there's a real opportunity there to sort of grow that affinity for the city with a new generation.
But there's always a but.
There's always a but in Detroit, especially.
I did find that the Rochester youth were sort of Pollyanna-ish about Detroit. It's like, well, we can get in, and together we can.
Right.
So it's great to hear the regional attitude and that Detroit does affect them. But the Detroit kids were in a completely different spot, and they really were seeing some of the deficits that the city has and profoundly affected by it. For example, their model was the only one I saw in the competition, and maybe it did happen in some of the other models, but I didn't see it, that had a prison.
Yeah. Right.
And they said they needed to have a prison because of safety.
Wow.
Their model had things like a pizza parlor, a barbershop, blah, 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 things that the Rochester kids would just take for granted.
They take those things for granted,
so that's not a future city for them.
Right.
For them, their future city is the space age Jetsons, thing where the Detroit kids were imagining a city that really ought to be right now.
That most other cities are like. See, that's really interesting.
Yes.
And so these two groups of kids competed. Who won?
Yeah, well, that's another interesting thing. We purposely set out to find a team that had some very good odds of winning, and a team that really was a newcomer in
maybe
it.
a long shot.
Yeah, a long shot. And so the Detroit team was a long shot, and it turned out that they got Rookie of the Year.
Oh, did they really? Well, see, there you go.
So they won a prize, and the Rochester team did place and went on to nationals and landed in the top 5. But that's so interesting because the Rochester team has launched this year after year after year.
Is that right?
I mean, they have a set of parents that work with them. They have power tools.
Yeah.
I mean, they are really quite sophisticated. The Detroit team, while they put in a lot of work, and this was an after-school supplemental program, it really was just
it's sort of
contest.
ragtag,
No
I mean, as we see a lot of that, obviously, the resource disparity is one of the things that we've got to really address. You know, I am curious about, given the work that you're doing on the Sustainable Detroit Project, what your reaction was to the census numbers, which showed that, again, we're not really sustaining we're much of anything. We are still shrinking.
Not only that, but I also worked not for the census, but I was with a nonprofit, and part of my job was to make sure everyone got counted. And I will tell you that I think more than in the past, they really kind of went under the rocks and trees to get people out. And so this question about recounting and finding more people, I'm a little worried about that because I think that the number might be closer to the true number than we're willing to admit.
Right. And so then what does that mean is the question, and I think that's the point we're not at yet. I mean, everyone seems sort of either shell-shocked by it, which I was, or ready to fight it. But there isn't yet that sort of, awakening that says, all right, this is the number. It's probably going to be lower in 10 years. How do you fix that so that it's okay, so it's just sustainable? I mean, the very word you use.
Well, a part of this project is we're also looking at Midtown, and there might be some sort of strategy that works where you can attract more people to certain areas of the city, and so I think if there's a hope, that's the hope.
Right. The part where you're looking at Midtown, what are you finding there? That's my question always about Midtown is, well, two questions really. Is what they're doing there sustainable? In other words, is it flash in the pan and in 5 years it's not going to be even what it is? And then second, how do you take what we're learning from what's happening in Midtown and apply it in other places? There are a lot of characteristics about that part of town that you wouldn't find other places. I mean, that's a commercial part of town, much more so than the Far East or West Sides.
Well, you know, and also there's a lot of money and subsidies happening in that area, so it's not sort of a free market. So when you take away those incentives, the question is who's going to really take advantage of it. But remember, Midtown has been, you know, a hot, trendy place for about 20 years. Right. People have been opening. Avalon has been there a long time. You know, there's been a lot of other vendors, a lot of other institutions that have really, Wayne State has been just wonderful, the medical center. So there's been a lot of sort of corporate citizens in that area that really have been over the long haul. So if they are proof positive that they're there for the long haul, and they're going to make it happen. But you're right, I don't know how transferable the lessons that we learn in Midtown are really going to be to other areas, because Midtown's a no-brainer. I mean, it's got so many anchor institutions that if there's hope, it's hope there. What the spill-off will be,
I mean, you know, one of the things that we still don't do very well in Detroit is neighborhoods. And when I say neighborhood, I'm thinking of places that I can relate to in Baltimore or Washington, D.C. or Chicago, where you have residential, commercial, and retail. That's the thing that we sort of miss. You know, I mean, there are all kinds of places in those cities where you could go and spend a Saturday night and you know, entertain yourself for the entire night. I can't think of very many neighborhoods in Detroit that are like that.
What we don't do well in Detroit is density.
That's right.
And so, but I think there's a younger generation that really likes the loft, condo. I mean, we think we should all have a single family dwelling, you know, a garage and a car. And then, but there's a generation that really doesn't ascribe to that. And going back to future cities, mass transit was a huge part of both of those models. And in fact, all of the models, I think, came in with mass transit as one of the #1 issues that they wanted to address. So I think we have a generation that's really thinking more about density. And with the density, you come with the multi-use areas. And that's our success.
You need more people and more capital. And that's our real problem in Detroit, I think, is the lack of capital. I mean, the people who are leaving are taking money with them, and they're not being replaced by people with more money.
And only Detroit would be gentrified by people that don't have money.
That's right.
That would only happen in Detroit. So a lot of the people that are coming back to Detroit are young people that really are, you know, they're artsy and wonderfully creative. They're not necessarily coming with a 6-figure job.
That's right.
And they may not really jumpstart our tax base right away. But we want them. Come back to Detroit.
No, we need them. But and again, in other cities, they're one component of the in-migration.
And different kinds of
we're not going to stop the overall net loss of population, and most big cities haven't. But I think what you want to do is replace what you're losing with people who have the capital to keep moving the tax base, growing the tax base, and moving the city forward.
Absolutely.
So what's the next part of sustainable cities? What's the part that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, we haven't figured out what direction we're going to go in after we talk about the young people and their vision. But certainly there's a lot to cover. And one thing that my personal interest is what makes Detroiters tick. And this is getting back to the census thing. I mean, we have to live in a certain level of denial, because if we looked at the reality, we would all just crawl up in a fetal position, right? And yet Detroiters have this feeling like, you know, you're with us or you're against us, you know, and you really got. So I really want to get into that psyche, because that again is something else that's going to make us sustainable. Can we infect others with this feeling of being an urban adventurer, an urban pioneer, and is that something that's sellable to people versus, you know, a community that's already made and picture perfect for families?
All right. Well, as always, great conversation. Thanks for being here.
And don't forget, I have a book coming out.
That's right. You have a book coming out.
Yep. My Blue Suede Shoes. It's out in bookstores now, and it's about domestic violence. So
right.
it's fiction with a mission.
Yeah.
So.